Welcome to the channel. I'm Amedio602, and today I'm going to take you through the journey of optimizing Warzone on your PC. I've got about 130 FPS right now, and our goal today is going to be to double that to 260 FPS using just a few simple steps, and I'm going to walk you through everything I'm going to do. The PC that we're optimizing has an RTX 3070 FTW3 Ultra, a Ryzen 5600X, and 16 gigabytes of PC 3600 memory. I'm going to get out of the game right now, and we're going to go through and we're going to install a different version of NVIDIA drivers. You can see I've already got drivers version 466.77 download. That's a pretty good version of drivers to use. You can also use the 457.30 version, and then you want to select the custom or advanced installation. The reason we want to do this is so we can do the clean installation. So I'm just going to leave all that stuff checked, and I'm going to also perform this clean installation. Restart your PC, and I'll be right back. While we're restarting, that's a great time to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. We're fresh back from rebooting, and you can see now it's installing the driver. This is where the screen's going to flash on and off a few times. The NVIDIA installer has finished. That's great. We're going to go ahead and close this. First thing I want to do is start up Warzone with this new driver, and we're just going to see what that took our frame rate to. When you start up Warzone after installing drivers, the first thing you're going to need to do on PC is reinstall the shaders. Shaders are very important. You just need to sit and let this finish. It only takes a few minutes. You can see on the screen that the shader installation is complete. I like to test frame rate changes down here under Private Match and Practice, Warzone Orientation. This will usually give you a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. I like to be standing still in the same position, just the starting position. Don't touch your keyboard, mouse, controller, whatever. And you can see right now this frame rate is jumping around quite a bit. It started at 130, it jumped up to 140, it went back down to 130, and we're going to go for two things in this video. First, and the most important, is we want a consistent frame rate. And secondly, we want to push that frame rate as high as we can. Our goal is 260 frames per second. The graph on the bottom of the screen there is from something called Riva Statistics Server. It's a free application you can download, and you can put overlays like frame rate and frame time on your screen. Frame rate, of course, is the number of frames per second. Frame time is how long it takes to draw each one of those frames. You want your frame rate to be as high as possible and your frame time to be as low as possible. One other thing to keep in mind is that in Warzone Orientation, the frame rate that you get is going to be a lot higher than you get in regular Verdansk. There are lots of reasons for that. You've got the draw distance, you've got other players, there's shooting, there's a lot more looting on the map. Under General, I do have my field of view maxed out at 120. A lot of players like to play on a lower field of view, that's fine. The field of view has a little bit of an impact on your frame rate. I do like to have the on-demand texture streaming disabled because I don't like the idea that the game is going to be downloading stuff in the background while I'm trying to play. Most of these other options are not going to impact your frame rate. Most of what we're concerned with is going to be over here on the graphics tab. The very first setting I have is Fullscreen Borderless, and I like to avoid it whenever possible. Sometimes it causes your frame rate to drop really low, and sometimes it makes it jump all around. I'm going to show you an example of that right now. You notice we're in Fullscreen Borderless. Let's just go back and look at this. You can see right now my frame rate's jumping all around. It's 130, 132, 140. It's kind of all over the map. It's all over the place. If I just go in here and change this one setting to full screen, notice now my frame rate is a lot higher and it's also a lot more consistent. You can see I'm at a very stable 159 to 160 FPS. When I originally started doing this testing, I thought that full screen borderless was just as good as full screen mode. And what you're going to see if you switch back to full screen borderless here, notice my frame rate looks pretty good and looks pretty consistent. Now, it's not quite as high as it was on full screen, but it's still pretty consistent and it's not that much lower. We only lost 10 frames going to that. But as soon as you switch out of this window, you're going to lose a bunch of frames and they never come back. So if you just Alt-Tab to something else, like the Blizzard loader, and Alt-Tab back into the game, look at that. We went from 140 frames down to 130, so we just lost another 10 frames. Playing on full screen borderless is costing you a lot of frames. Don't do it. The other issue with full screen borderless, as you can see right now, my frame rate started jumping around again. So it might jump back up to 140 and then back down to 130. And those dips cause packet burst. If you want to learn more about packet burst, I've got a couple of videos on the channel, links down in the description below. So we're going to go ahead and switch this back to full screen. The display adapter, this is really only going to be used for laptop systems. For the most part, you're not going to need to mess with this. Your screen refresh rate should be set as high as your monitor can handle. In my case, I'm using a 1440p 170Hz monitor. I have a video review of this monitor on the channel.
Pick up the armor.
Down here, your render resolution is super important. If your monitor supports 1440p and your hardware supports a decent frame rate at 1440p, my preference is to play in 1440p. 1440p has a lot more pixels than 1080p, so your frame rate's going to go down significantly when you change to 1440p. As an example, in full screen mode, I'm getting right around 160 FPS in 1440p.
Are you daft? Armor plates.
If I change my render resolution, I can render all the way down at 1080p. We can apply that, and you can see that immediately gave me a lot more frames. I went from 160 frames up to 205 frames. You're going to gain about 25% more frames if you switch from 1440p to 1080p. If you're targeting higher frame rates, that's one of the easiest things you can do to get a higher frame rate. For the remainder of these tests, we're going to be back at 1440p, which is the native resolution of my monitor. Your aspect ratio doesn't really impact your frame rate that much. For most people, automatic should be fine. VSync, you definitely want to have that disabled. My recommendation is to leave the custom frame rate limit disabled because Warzone has a pretty pathetic optimization when it comes to frame rate limits. Right now, even in my test where I'm not moving around, you're going to notice the frame time jumping around. I see 7.6, 8.3, 8.4, 8.6. I've got a huge variance of up to a millisecond here, just because of how they've implemented their frame rate limiter. NVIDIA highlights, this is an interesting one because the option in the game has absolutely no impact on your frame rate. Right now you see I've got highlights disabled and my frame rate right around 160. If I go ahead and enable the NVIDIA highlights, my frame rate stays around 160. In order for this option to have any effect, you have to have highlights enabled in the GeForce Experience overlay. You can bring up the overlay by default by holding in Alt and pressing Z. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead in here, go to Options, go to Highlights. Notice how highlights are enabled for this game right now. If you disable the highlights in here, notice my FPS jumped immediately all the way to 167, so I got 7 frames per second. Now if you go in and disable this in here, notice that doesn't make any difference. So there are 2 different settings for NVIDIA highlights. The important thing to know is to use the overlay and not the in-game setting to disable it. NVIDIA Reflex low latency. The proper value of this setting is going to depend on whether your system is limited by the CPU or the GPU. You almost never want to have this disabled. The reason you want to have it enabled is to have the low latency feature, and you only want to use enabled plus boost if you are bound in the CPU. Depending on your resolution and some of your options, you might be bound CPU, you might be bound GPU. To determine whether your system is GPU bound or CPU bound, look at the GPU time and CPU time overlays. Whichever one of those numbers is higher is the bottleneck in your system, and that's going to be your bound case. For example, right now you can see my GPU time is 5 milliseconds and my CPU time is the same, right at 5 milliseconds, which makes it really hard to tell which one is bound because this only rounds to the nearest millisecond. You might need to play with a few different settings to see which one it is for your system. Notice when I lower to 1080p, my CPU time will occasionally dip down to 3 milliseconds, while my GPU time is constantly at 4 milliseconds. That means in this case, I am GPU bound. Another easy way to tell is to try out both of these modes in Warzone orientation, keep an eye on your frame rate, and see which one works best for you. The next option here for display is really based on whether you're using a monitor or a TV, so just leave this alone. I would recommend leaving streaming quality set to normal if your video card has enough RAM. If it doesn't, you can change it to low. Notice the little padlock here means I cannot change it in-game, you have to go back to the main menu to change this. The next option is texture resolution. With this set to high, I'm getting 165 to 166 frames per second. If we change that to normal, you see my FPS boosts just a little bit up to that 169 point. When we change it to low, let's see what happens with our FPS. Looks like it boosts up to 173, so we're getting more FPS, but not a whole lot more. And setting the texture resolution on very low, that's going to give you the biggest FPS boost to 177. So really our range here is a max of 177 up to a min of 167.
Grab the armor
I like to
plates.
leave my texture resolution on either high or normal. Next we're going to look at the texture filter with the value set on high. Recall right now we're getting right around 169 frames per second.
Are you daft?
We're going to change
Armor
that to normal.
plates, pick 'em up.
That takes us to 169 frames per second. So not a big difference there.
You can do this, mate. I
If we
believe
change
in
it
you.
from normal to
Grab
low,
the
you're
armor
going to see
plates.
frame rates don't really change all that much. So we're still right around that 169, 170 frames. So we're going to leave that set on high. Our particle quality is also a really interesting one. When the particle quality is set to low, you actually get fewer
I am
frames per
incredibly
second
patient.
if you're
I
standing
can
still.
literally wait forever until you pick up that armor.
Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me that this particular setting lets you have more frames if it's on high. I do like to keep mine set to low anyway
Pick up
because
the
when you
armor.
start to fire a weapon, it's going to have an impact then. So even though it's a little bit of a frame rate hit right now, we're going to set this to low. For bullet impact and sprays, I like to leave those enabled. That gives you the tactical advantage of being able to see where shots are landing.
Grab some armor
Tessellation.
plates.
Let's see what kind of an impact this has on our frame rate. If I have tessellation set to all, my frame rate is right there at 165 to 166. With a tessellation of near only, we're still about the same, although we're in an enclosed space right now, so the
you
tessellation
daft?
probably
Armor
is all
plates,
near
pick
right
'em
now.
up.
If you disable it completely, you can see your frame rate does go up by just 1 or 2. So because of that, I like to keep my tessellation set to near. I have on-demand texture streaming disabled. Shadow map resolution has a significant impact on your frame rate. Right now, with extra shadows enabled, we are getting right around that 165 to 166 FPS.
I
If
am
we set that
incredibly
to high
patient.
instead
I
of
can literally
extra,
wait forever
our
until you
frames
pick
go
up
up by
that
about
armor.
3. Going from high to normal, our frame rates are going to go up by about another 3 frames per second. And if
Pick
we
up
go
the
all the way
armor.
to low for shadow map resolution, our frame rates are back up to 172. I like to set my shadow map resolution to normal because I'm willing to give up
Grab
a
some
few
armor
extra
plates.
frames to have better shadows. Caching spot shadows and sun shadows doesn't have a huge impact on frame rates, but I do like to leave both of those enabled. You can disable them if you don't have enough video memory to handle that. Particle lighting is very important. It's important because when there are explosions, all those particles need to be drawn by the system. This is one of the big reasons why you can drop frames
You
in the
can do
middle of a
this,
fight.
mate. I believe in you.
With my
Grab
particle
the armor
lighting set to
plates.
ultra, you can see we're still at that 170 frames per second. This is another one of those settings that you really have to be in the real game. Warzone orientation standing still just doesn't
I am
do this
incredibly
justice.
patient.
I like my particle lighting on either low or normal. Doesn't really make a huge difference to me while I'm playing. The next option is
Pick up the
Raytracing,
armor.
and that is a huge one to disable because it uses a ton of system resources. Right now, with Raytracing enabled, you can see I'm getting 171 frames per second. If I disable DirectX Raytracing, you can see
Grab
my
some
frames are
armor
going to jump
plates.
all the way up to 190. So I got 20 frames from one option. Ambient Occlusion adds soft shadows intersecting with each other, creating depth. You can have your ambient occlusion enabled with
can
both
do
here.
this, mate.
You
I
can see
believe
with
in you.
both, my
Grab
frames
the
are
armor
right around that
plates.
191. If you change your ambient occlusion to MDAO, your frames will go up quite a bit from 191 to 200 for me. If you have ambient occlusion set to static objects only, you can see you
I am
don't get
incredibly
as big of a
patient.
boost from
I can
that.
literally wait forever until
If
you
you
pick up that
disable
armor.
ambient occlusion altogether, you can get quite a few frames from that, so I keep my ambient occlusion disabled. Another reason that I disable ambient occlusion is because I do not play with the 2x anti-aliasing, and you can see the warning at the bottom of the screen, warning about visual noise if you don't have 2x anti-aliasing. So for me, it's a 10 frame boost if I disable this. The next option is SSR, and this is the quality of reflection. Again, we've got the same warning in yellow about 2x anti-aliasing, and since I'm not going to leave that enabled, I'm going to turn this all the way off. And you can see that boosts our frames by about 5. I leave my Filmic Strength set to 1 because of the note down at the bottom.
Armor plates, pick 'em up.
If we change this all the way to 0, you notice we have about the same frame rate, so 207 FPS and 207 FPS. DLSS is an option
You can
that
do
I
this,
think
mate.
everyone
I
should
believe in
avoid
you.
unless you're
Grab
on a
the armor
lower end
plates.
system trying to play on something like a 4K or an 8K TV, The reason I don't like DLSS is because it makes the screen look blurry. In ultra performance mode, you can see my frame rates boost significantly, but just look at those armor plates in the center of the screen. They're moving all around. The outline, the border and all that, it's so super blurry and it makes the game look absolutely awful, at least in 1440p on my machine.
Pick up the armor.
So let's try performance mode. In performance mode, I get kind of the same thing as the ultra performance mode, and I definitely don't want to play the game with the armor plates jingling around on the screen like that. In balance mode, you can see we have really more of the same thing. And quality mode, yeah, it's way too blurry, things are moving around on me way too much. I'm not a fan of DLSS in Warzone at all, so I leave that completely disabled. I've talked about this one quite a few times. You can see with the Filmic SMAA T2X anti-aliasing, we're back right around that 207 frames per second. If we switch to just the T2X and remove the Filmic portion, our frames jump all the way up to 214, so we gain 7 frames per second there. If we go to 1X SMAA, you can see we're up to 236 frames per second, and if we disable anti-aliasing completely, we're all the way up to 247 frames per second. My personal preference for this setting is to leave the anti-aliasing at 1X because I think the game looks just fine that way. I like to leave depth of field disabled because the description here says that when it's enabled, things outside your field of view are blurry. I don't like blurriness in my Call of Duty games. I like to be able to see my enemies. World motion blur and weapon motion blur, definitely leave both of those disabled. Film grain is the next option. Again, I like to be able to see my enemies, so I turn my film grain all the way down to 0. Enabling dynamic resolution lets you target a frame rate and have the game automatically change the resolution it's displaying. If you're having trouble maintaining a certain frame rate that you're trying to target, you can use this. It's not something I personally recommend, but right now we're going to change this to target 260 frames per second. And notice it'll definitely be able to target way above that. It overshoots its target quite a bit. Now the game just looks grainy and not very good. You might as well just play it at a lower resolution. Now that we've gone through all the graphic settings of the game, we've managed to boost our FPS from 130 all the way to 237. But our goal's 260, so we're gonna keep going. From here on out, all the changes are gonna be in Windows, so we're gonna exit Modern Warfare. The next thing to check in Windows is how many different applications you have running. You can see down here, I've got 9 different things running. This is just for USB hardware that's connected, so that's not a big deal. We have Bluetooth turned on. You can see Windows Security is running. The BattleNet launcher down here, voice meter, I use that for a dual PC streaming setup. NVIDIA settings, MSI Afterburner, which we're going to talk about next. Riva Statistics Server, which we've talked about a little bit, and Discord. If you have a whole lot of other things running down here, that's just going to use up precious system resources. If you right-click down here on the taskbar, you can get the Task Manager, and when you're not playing, you should be able to just go to this Performance tab right here, and this overall CPU utilization should be very low. Anything more than about 10% is cause for concern because that means other applications are using your PC resources. You can see which applications those are by opening up the resource monitor here. You can just sort by CPU usage. You can see my CPU usage is hovering right around 2 to 3%, and that's in the acceptable range. If you do have a bunch of stuff running, then I would recommend clicking on the Startup tab and checking the list here to see if there's anything that you can disable on system startup. Another thing to be careful about is if you have any other games installed, you don't want them to be downloading updates while you're playing Warzone. So if you've got the Epic Game Launcher or EA Origins or anything like that, you want to make sure that those are not running. We're still stuck at 235 frames, so the next step in our journey to getting to our 260 frame rate goal is going to be overclocking. Overclocking is something that I'm comfortable doing. You may not be comfortable because there is a small chance that you'll hurt your hardware, and overclocking is going to void your warranty, so don't do it unless you're comfortable doing so. When overclocking, there are 3 different things that you typically can overclock. You can overclock your GPU, your CPU, and your RAM. First, we're going to look at overclocking the GPU because this system was GPU bound. To do that, we're going to use a program called MSI Afterburner. Afterburner works great for NVIDIA cards. I'm not 100% sure about AMD cards. I'm sure the process for this is different. I haven't owned an AMD card in probably about 15 years, so please don't ask me how to overclock them. There are lots of good videos about overclocking your GPU on YouTube. That's outside the scope of this video, so I'm just going to go ahead and load a profile here that I've already set up. On this profile, we have an overclock of 1000 megahertz on the RAM. we're going to go ahead and open the curve editor. You can see that on this NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3070, we've undervolted, and we've also increased the power limit. I've tested this, it seems to be pretty stable on my system, so we're going to go ahead and apply. And that's all there is to it once you've figured out the proper numbers. We finished overclocking with Afterburner, and you can see our frames have jumped up by about 10 to the 246 mark. Next, I'm going to check my memory clock speeds using a program called CPU-Z. Memory speeds can be a little bit tricky. Right now, you can see we're running in dual channel mode at 1330 megahertz. Because this is dual channel mode, you can double this number, which gives us 2660. But this RAM is rated for up to 3600 megahertz. That means I need to go into my BIOS and enable something called XMP. XMP lets you change the clock speed of your memory so that it matches your manufacturer's recommendation. Another name for XMP is DOCP. If you're seeing very low memory clock speeds like this 1330, that means you need to go into your BIOS and enable your XMP or DOCP profile. To get into the BIOS, reboot your PC, and you'll usually have to press the delete button. Sometimes it's F1 or F2 or something else, depends on your motherboard. This will get you into the BIOS. The motherboard that I'm using right now is a Tough Gaming X570 Plus. By default, this BIOS is going to boot into something called Easy Mode, and you can hit the down arrow key to get to DOCP. Like we said before, this has been disabled. So you just press Enter, up arrow, Profile 1. When we do that, we can see next to that, it pops up DDR4. 3597. That means we're going to be using the manufacturer's profile to run this RAM at 3600 megahertz. So we're going to push F10 to save and reset, and then press Enter to save those changes. We just finished rebooting after changing the DOCP in the BIOS. You can see now CPU-Z reports that we are still in dual channel mode at about 1800 megahertz. Again, you double that to get to 3600. You want this number to be as high as possible most of the time. There are some oddities with AMD processors where going above a certain threshold is a bad idea because of this thing called the Infinity Fabric. If you want me to make a video about that, let me know in the comments down below and we can cover that topic as well. We're still 14 frames shy of our goal, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to drop into the BIOS and we're going to mess around with some of the AMD overclocking options. One other note about overclocking is the procedure is going to be different for Intel chips than it is for AMD chips. If you have an Intel chip, I recommend checking out other videos on YouTube because other people are much more experienced in that than me, and they'll be able to guide you along that process. We are back into the BIOS now. Unfortunately, with what we're trying to do with the AMD overclocking, we need to get into advanced mode. So you can just press F7 on the keyboard. And in here, again, your motherboard's probably going to be different from mine. We're going to go over to the advanced tab. And the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to go all the way down to AMD overclocking. Do you accept this? Read the warning. Make sure that you agree to the risks of overclocking. From the overclocking menu, you want to go down to Precision Boost Overdrive. In the Precision Boost Overdrive menu, change this to Advanced. We are going to change this CPU Boost Clock Override all the way to 200 megahertz. If you have a Ryzen 3000 series processor, really this 200 megahertz boost is about the best you can do. However, if you have a 5000 series, by the way, I'm using a 5600X, then you can go to PBO Limits, Disable, Curve Optimizer, and we want to enable all cores to have a -30 Curve Optimizer magnitude. When we set the settings like this, we're doing something called undervolting to the CPU. That means that running at the same frequency, that processor is going to be using less voltage, which lets it hit that 200 megahertz max increased boost speed that we just specified. We press F10 to save our settings. We're back from our AMD overclocking, and as expected, our frame rate didn't really change. We are getting better performance from our processor, but since that's not the bottleneck, it's not going to make much difference. So we really do need to eke out just a little bit more performance from the GPU. The very first thing I'll mention is if I disable this overlay, you can see my frames boost up by about 5. That gets us to 250 frames, which is pretty close to our target. What I'm going to do next is I'm just going to close down that Riva statistics server process that we've been using. All right, you can see Riva is no longer running. Now that we've disabled Riva, you can see our frame rate is up to 260, and that goes to show that even a high-performance program that's meant for profiling and things like that, that overlay on the screen cost me about 5 frames per second, and just having the program running in the background cost me another 5 frames per second. Going back through, we're just checking all the settings again. I have had a couple times today where some of these settings have gotten reset on me for whatever reason. Now you can see the cache shadows settings keep getting changed on me. I'm not sure exactly why that's happening. But you can see what we've got here. That matches everything we talked about, and you can see we're getting a pretty stable, right around 260 frames per second. So let's drop into a real game of Warzone and see what our frames look like. Alright, we dropped into a real game of Warzone. You can see our FPS, while we're dropping in, is right around the 140 to 150 mark. Let's see what it looks like once we hit the ground. And we're right around that 160 to 170. Keep in mind 170 is the max refresh rate of the monitor I'm using. So to get 170 frames on a 170 Hertz monitor playing in 1440p, I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe we can come over here and get into some fights and see what it looks like when we're in combat. Because knowing what the frame rate drop looks like is pretty important. I was half aiming and half looking at the FPS on the screen there. You could probably tell if you were watching my eyes.
I'm coming to get you.
I'm coming to get you. You playing? I guess not. Today we went through the graphic settings of Warzone, went through and changed quite a few of those to what I would consider to be optimum values. We disabled the highlights feature in the NVIDIA overlay, then we went through and overclocked our CPU, our GPU, and set our RAM up to use the DOCP profile. When we finished with all that, our frames went from 130 all the way to 260 in the Warzone orientation. Effectively, we doubled our frame rate. That gives us frame rates right around 170 Hz in 1440p on Warzone. If this guide helped you out at all, I'd really appreciate you dropping a like on the video and leaving a comment letting me know your PC specs as well as how many frames you were able to get. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so that you don't miss out on my future videos. And as always, thank you very much for watching.